Mr. Grimsrud, what's up, man?
Good to see you.
I know, I love it. We're back, and I think you just said last time we did this, it was before the pandemic. So wait a second. Lawyers now don't use conference bridges. They can actually get on video calls. How about that, right?
I mean, barely. 35% of the time I still have a problem, but here I am.
I'm happy you just didn't forward me a Citrix GoToMeeting conference bridge. All right. So I digress already. So this is going to be fun. So Dan, for the listeners, because we're going to be jumping into operating agreements, how the operating agreements can be a way to get an ownership alignment between different parties, and then how to roll that through to the leadership team, et cetera. But what's your background, man? For the people that have not listened to your previous interview with me, why don't you give them your background? I think you have some interesting aspects of your education too, man, that make it an interesting set of circumstances to do what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, mostly just miseducated, which is always interesting, right? But no, I was accounting and finance in undergrad, and just knew that I, wanted to be in an entrepreneurial space, but also just sort of thought I didn't necessarily want to be an accountant, wanted a little different place to sit, maybe a little broader lens. And so, went to law school and, right away kind of got into the business of helping people kind of organize and their businesses from a legal perspective. And, have over time started off kind of for probably 10 years doing mostly kind of that organizational stuff, a ton of operating agreements and shareholder agreements and that kind of stuff, getting stuff set up on the front end. And then, have ultimately evolved into doing a fair amount of M&A, activity, and actually really interesting, I think, to see, operating agreements at the beginning of things, and then to understand, the implications for how those things are put together in an exit stage situation. And so, kind of have looked at these things from a lot of different angles at a lot of different places in the life cycle of a business over, I can't believe it, but 20 years now. So it's been,
and no messes, all clean. No,
yeah, right.
You couldn't even keep the smile off your face.
No. And that's the thing. I think I think the messes kind of are sometimes the places where you learn the most, right? About, understanding the limitations, understanding the importance of the documents and of getting on the same page on the front end. And then also understanding that there has to be, a process of checking back in, because as businesses evolve, things that you thought made perfect sense at one stage of the life cycle don't make sense anymore. So it's got to be an ongoing thing. And I think anybody that tells you they can give you a document that you can just throw in a drawer and that'll be working well 20 years later is not being realistic about how the world works.
Yeah. And so has the messy, I think is the only messy is, how did you word it that we can learn some things from that? So what our goal is with this episode is don't learn on your own dime. Right?
Yeah. Right.
Let's learn on Dan's experiences and mine experience and our experiences dime. So that way you can hopefully avoid some of this. And coming from my own angle, my own perspective, 3 partnership buyouts, as well as even the family business. We had a couple as well. So that doesn't count the dozens of our clients. And I can't even imagine how many you've gone through. So Dan, one of the things that I want to do for this, as we were talking about the mini series and ownership and the leadership, those roles need to be separate. The operating agreement talks about that too. Different ownership groups have different timelines, different desires. And it's so crazy, man. Cause the amount of people I talk to every day who are just not even close to aligned or on the same page with their partners, they originally had to have a partnership agreement. So somehow they thought through this. So why don't you just give us what do you normally see that the normal practice of starting an operating agreement is when someone's jumping into business?
Yeah. I mean, it's all over the map, right? I mean, it's a fair, there's a fairly frequently people kind of try to figure something out on their own. And then they come to us either when they're bringing someone in or when they realize there's something that they didn't deal with that they need to. I mean, obviously, our the preferred scenario is someone's coming to you with your idea and you're kind of starting at the beginning with getting something in place that you think can work, at least for that first stage of the business. But, I think to me, it's, and I've said to you before, I always say I'm going to probably say things that are going to get me in trouble with the lawyers union. I think one of the problems that happens is that people try to every time they draft a new document, they come up with a new provision, and then they put that in their template, and pretty soon their template is an 80-page document, and they say, this covers every scenario. I mean, two things about that. One, it's really just really hard for people to deal with, right? People entrepreneurs are not lawyers for the most part, usually. Lawyers aren't usually very good entrepreneurs. And so they don't know, that you put a document in front of them that there's, of the 80 pages, 78 are things that they don't know what they're about. And it ends up being,
let's start with getting people like that to read the subject line in the email that the attachment is getting delivered by. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think to me, it's about, in a perfect world, you're sitting down with someone having a conversation about, okay, what is the business? Who are the constituents? To your point, is it 3 people starting a business?
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Why don't you actually, because I can see you're going down this path, walk through what is the purpose of an operating agreement? Because I know the enemy or the perfect is enemy of the good, but there is an intent for the operating agreement. Why don't you just walk us through that?
Yeah. So it's just setting, it's sort of setting the rules of the road, right? I mean, it's creating expectations for the partners. Obviously, the parties to an operating agreement are all owners of the business. And so they can be in different categories, but they all have an ownership interest. And so you're using the operating agreement to set expectations for everyone about what that ownership means for them. And, and to provide some certainty on key pieces, and part of what I object to about sort of the process of saying I've updated my document over the years and now it's 80 pages is it creates this false sense of security that document can deal with every scenario that could ever unfold and can provide complete certainty on everything. I think what you want to do is sit down with the people who are going to be owners and say, okay, what are you doing? Where are you at? What are you putting in here? And you tell me first what you really care about here. What are the core elements of this business and this partnership that you really care about, that everyone wants to be on the same page on? And then I'll tell you the core things that I think you need to be on the same page on. And then once we have that list of the things that matter to you and the things that matter to me, we can put something together that you can all use as a jumping off place, with the understanding that as things evolve over time, we're going to have to revisit some of that.
Mm-hmm. And what I'm thinking about, like how we can structure this conversation, Dan, with that kind of context, is what I think is, knowing that you and I work with clients a lot to do this, we can use just the overarching questions that people will be asked. So like I can kind of play the role of like, hey, as a business owner, these are my thoughts, and everything from like the inception, but then all the way to like, hey, there's going to be a buyout. Cause like that's kind of that overarching arc that you're talking about. But I was thinking about like the 80-page document is one, but then also I could think about probably there's 90% probably that I could see it's like the equivalent having the ADP sign in front, or ADP. Yeah. Of like, hey, you actually don't have a security system, so it's there's no document there, but there's all of the spirit of the original discussion. Yeah. So let's talk about like when two people, or let's say a couple of partners, come together and they have to do what? Like, how do you what are some of the main core things that the partnership has to agree upon on the outset?
Yeah. So when we're talking about an entity, a partnership, for example, certainly, when we're talking about an operating agreement, that conversation presumes that you have an entity, right? So you formed an entity, and now you're saying, how are we going to govern ourselves? And the way I think about operating agreements or shareholder agreements, I think you have sort of 4 key elements. You have governance, obviously, who's going to decide what. And I think a good operating agreement, especially in a partnership scenario with 2 or more people, probably there's a couple different components to that, but I'll just sort of lay it out across the top first. You've got governance, you got economics, you've got, an exit plan, and then you've got to talk about kind of a crisis response plan, right? And so I think those are kind of the key elements in my mind, is sort of if you talk about all those things and have a conversation around the expectations of the partners in those categories, I think you're pretty far on the way to having a document that does the job. And so
I love that, man.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say before, because I could see us unpacking each of those and how those 4 categories can be handled differently as time elapses. But before that, Dan, like I think about all the clients that I end up having conversations with where it's like, oh, I was at a conference or I was at this trade show or at the bar and Dan and I are going to start a business. And, you know, whether it's 2 companies that have synergistic and they want to have a JV relationship, or it's 2 people that actually want to start an entity, but there's a mismatch of the quote unquote resources. Is it IP? Is it cash? Is it labor? How do you figure out what is, you know, equal to things that are being contributed when people are actually spinning up the entity or the capital contributions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really tricky. And it's not only tricky because it's a delicate sort of process of trying to be a facilitator, you know, without having anybody in the conversation feel like you're trying to advocate for one or the other. But certainly part of facilitating is saying, okay, you know, this person's putting in $1 million and you're putting in this idea that, you know, doesn't really have adequate IP protection around it right now. So I'm not sure if that sounds like 50-50 to me, you know? And so trying to figure out how to facilitate that, I think I'm a believer in, you know, having that conversation as opposed to from my chair, as opposed to just saying, geez, I don't want to touch that and I'll draft it however you tell me to, because then it tends to get a little tricky down the line when they have that conversation at a time that's too late. Yep. The other thing I would just say on that point, Ryan, that I think is important in this whole thing is, you know, the importance of having tax advisors that are involved. They don't need to be involved at we're going to engage them for 100 hours kind of level. And we, you know, just like you, I mean, we have a ton of accountants and tax advisors that we work with that, you know, oftentimes, even if I can't persuade a client or if they're at a point where they don't have the wherewithal or the budget to get a sophisticated tax advisor on board, I mean, I'll just use some context of mine to make some calls. Because when you talk about like something like that, sometimes people come in and say, I'm going to contribute 1,000 hours of work to this thing, and you're going to contribute some cash. Well, you know, if you put in $1 million and I get 50% for a contribution of time, that's a taxable event for me. You know, it's just one example of a place where I've stepped in something that wasn't on my radar. So, you know, what I always try to do is get everybody first thing to just dump all the pieces of the puzzle on the table, tell me everything that you have in mind, and then let me sort of say, okay, here's some parameters and some things we need to deal with to make sure that we get this done in a way that doesn't create unforeseen challenges for you.
Yeah, so I love that. And I want to unpack that a little bit more before we move on to those 4 components. So like, is it fair to say too, like with the reason for the tax advisor, where I'm thinking about the examples that I've been involved in, where it's like, there's the human reason of saying, Dan, you're putting in $1 million. I'm putting in $1 million of IP because I think the IP is worth $1 million. So we're both coming to the table of what we think the transaction is going to be worth based on fair market. But then you kind of like, is it safe to say that like agree upon that and then go to the tax advisor and be like, now let's not step in a big pile of dog shit because our egos were in the way. We're like, if you told me I could do something differently and then save money where I'd have to reduce my IP value or whatever it is, but like, it's not an ego reason.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's so huge is, you know, for people. And I always that's why I said, I like to try to, you know, not to say that I'm trying to interrogate people, but I do like to try to press those partners in that initial meeting to make sure that everybody understands everybody else's expectations and that they get on the same page first. And then if those stakes are in the ground about what everybody expects, then you can build something, including, like you said, something that's maybe a little different than what they had in mind. But you can say, we're going to go in a little different direction because it's going to be more tax efficient as long as everybody is on the same page as far as sort of those key pieces of who's getting what and why, you know? So
let's, the IP, I think you covered a great example. Cash or equipment or things that are hard assets like that, there's just probably an equal like exchange and then the tax wrap around it. You covered the IP. You mentioned the labor too. Yeah. And I see this get messed up so much because owners and we're going to separate for the rest of this conversation, ownership, equity ownership versus W-2 wages. So the ownership wants to have you talk about ownership, but then the labor, right?
Yeah.
So ownership, I see so many times when they have a role, it's like, let's not take a salary because we can take our distributions. And there's all this conflating that goes in. But why don't you explain let's say you and I are partners. I'm going to be working for 1,000 hours. You are providing capital. How do we handle the ownership versus leadership concept with that example?
It's so huge, and you're so right. It's one of the places where you see the most problems with misaligned expectations. If you have an idea and the ability to sort of drive it toward liftoff, but you don't have the capital and I have the capital, and so we have an arrangement where I'm going to put in $1 million and you're going to bring your willingness to help us achieve liftoff. We have to be incredibly, first of all, we have to be careful on two fronts. One, we have to be careful that we do that in a way that doesn't jam you up. Because if I put in $1 million and you put in $1 and a promise to work 1,000 hours, you just got 50% of a business that has $1 million valuation. And you just had a $500,000 ordinary income tax event because you just got basically paid wages of $500,000. It doesn't matter that you got them in the form of 50% of a business that's worth $1 million. You got them. And so that's a nightmare. And people don't realize that. The other piece is, if you don't have clear agreement and alignment around expectations, you get resentment in both directions, right? You get, totally. You did the work, and for some reason that beyond your control, we did not achieve liftoff. And so my investment didn't return what I hoped it might. And now I'm mad and I'm sort of saying, geez, you should give me money because I lost $1 million. And then the flip side is true too. In the obviously better scenario, we do achieve liftoff, and you make it happen with the expertise and the work that you bring to the table. And then you're really not pleased about sharing 50% with me because you're saying I'm the guy making it happen. And how does this guy get, which is why, a lot of times, like you think about that scenario you just described, I'm probably going to end up, it's oversimplifying, but I'm probably going to end up talking to those people about some different tranches. I'm probably going to end up talking to them about maybe I get some kind of preferred return on the first tranche of money that comes in. So I do get back some of the cash I put in before you get, a big return. But then maybe tranche 2, once I get made whole, is that you get a time period where you get more of that return than I do because you're the one that made it happen. And then maybe tranche 3 is it settles into some kind of equilibrium.
I loving that. So, because again, you're addressing the fact that it's going to evolve, and I just want to make sure that we're clear here that we're talking from the ownership, which the ownership cares about equity growth and distributions and the return on the capital. So, in this example, if I'm working 1,000 hours for my ownership, so therefore technically my wages are foregone. Yeah. To buy in the ownership. So explain how that is work. Cause let me give you it's a legit example of someone I know where they had this example where capital goes in, liftoff was taken, liftoff happened. And it was like real liftoff, dude. I'm talking high 8 figures, close to 9-figure liftoff. And because they didn't get this arranged the right way, the original investors were taking a salary the whole freaking time. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of salaries because they were when they put their money in originally, they're well, I'm not getting a salary. You are. So again, they're conflating W-2 wages, ownership. You tracking me? Totally. And I think in the example, to go back to the example you use where you and I are partners, the other thing you'd have to do in that scenario is say, okay, what happens to Ryan's compensation expectations for his work in the business? What happens to those once he's sort of paid back that initial sort of commitment of labor? And so, I think you're so right that it's a huge place where people go wrong, where they don't deal with on the front end. Okay, we have a 4-person partnership group, but we really have 3 investors and 1 entrepreneur. And that entrepreneur is going to be working in the business every day, all day. And these other 3 investors are doing other things and they're providing the capital. You've got to deal with upfront that separate issue of if you're the entrepreneur, your compensation for that work you're doing. And so, like I said, sometimes
some of the compensation is in the form of, well, that's how they got their units. But nobody is going to be okay with that forever and ever and ever, right? I mean, you've got to say, okay, we're giving you this 25% interest with these expectations around achieving liftoff, but that doesn't mean you're an indentured servant for the rest of your life. So here's what happens. We pivot into a new arrangement where you have this, employment arrangement that gives you some kind of, salary, which in the partnership context is referred to as a guaranteed payment, and maybe on top of that, a kicker, that creates alignment with short-term and long-term. But that's one of the things that people don't do. And it causes huge issues with some clients that, some that you and I have had in common over the years that we could both think of where, over time, as things evolve, sometimes it's just that one person doesn't work very hard. Sometimes it's just that the business evolves in a way where the skills and talents of one partner become much more important to the business than the skills and talents of other partners. And if you don't have some mechanic to deal with that so that you can, sort of not have that massive resentment bomb go off in the middle of your business, and
it's not a bomb that goes off immediately too. You and I,
no,
it's like one of the Mario ones where it goes like from black and it slowly starts going and then it gets white and then it blows up and no one knows where it came from.
And it blows up at a time when the business is usually that's a time when the business has some value and the blow and the explosion is pretty darn disruptive.
Well, and I think about like what we just covered too. We ebbed and flowed through W-2 wage roles and ownership roles. And when you're talking about expectations too, and especially when people have different timelines or you have different ownership groups. It could be Dan Grimsrud is also partners with a private equity firm that has different things that people need. So when you're walking through an operating agreement, how do you segment out ownership goals and then leadership roles and how those should be clarified?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you first have to understand, the full picture in terms of who's bringing what, in terms of capital, and then who's bringing what in terms of sort of skills, talents, expertise that the company's going to need going forward. And you have to have a conversation about what is that second group of people going to get that the first group doesn't. And oftentimes it's not even, not to complicate the world, but oftentimes it's not even in the operating agreement. You're talking at some point about another document, right? Because you're sort of saying, okay, the operating agreement is going to govern, Ryan and I are coming into this business and I'm bringing nothing but capital and he's bringing nothing but sort of experience, expertise. We're going to have an arrangement that's going to say how we're going to make decisions, how the economics of distributions are going to flow. But then we're also going to have an arrangement. If I'm smart about this, and this is there are a lot of really sophisticated business people who do a lot of these kinds of partnerships where they bring capital and somebody else brings that business expertise. And one of the things I think I would say in observing those folks, they're wanting to have conversations around the compensation of the person in that experience expertise share right from the beginning, because they want everybody to know, I know this matters and I want to value it. Because the only way to have this be a long-term partnership is to have that person be rewarded for that sweat, that they're pouring into the business. And if you don't have that conversation because you think, oh, this is going to be great, I'm going to sort of get away with one, and Ryan's not, the only thing you're doing is ensuring that you will have that bomb go off if the business is successful. And because if it's successful, you're going to come to me and say, this is madness. I mean, I'm killing myself here and we've achieved liftoff and we never dealt with this and we need to deal with it now. And that's a tough time to have that conversation. If we've created something on the front end that we both think is fair and we've dealt with the fact that you're going to be killing yourself in that business, and then you come to me later and say, geez, we're killing it and I just think I should get a greater share than I have been. At least now I'm in a position where we operated in good faith on the front end and we had the conversation and I can say, geez, I mean, I'm open to this discussion, but it's not like we didn't have this conversation and we came up with something that we thought was fair. So maybe we should live with it. But when you've never had the conversation about what's different between ownership and sort of the management and the day-to-day running of the business, it's 100% of the time. The only scenarios where it doesn't become a problem are where the business fails. because
people aren't arguing about who can
yeah.
pay off the most amount of debt.
Right. Then you never have to worry about it because it's just like nobody wants to fight over a carcass. Right.
But you're so true. It's so right, man. And the resentment that I've watched. I mean, I did a podcast years ago called Solving Problems Through Payroll, because people don't understand valuations. They don't understand when and how the trade-offs of distributions versus reinvestments work. So everybody gets $200,000.
Yeah,
that's exactly. Yeah. I mean, truly, it's like, well, this one guy hasn't stepped into the office for 10 years, but he still gets a salary.
Totally.
And it's because, well, we didn't understand how this works. So I want to go kind of loop back to the tranches. So there's some challenges with pass-through entities where, and it's so funny because as we get into like ESOPs and exit analysis, down the road, people really have to start thinking about this because the percentage of ownership mandates the distributions. So like, let's kind of throw in, Dan, like, let's say you're twice my age, you have different wealth perspectives. And so because I think about, the client I talked to this morning, there's always, it's partnerships, brother-in-laws that are timeline differences, wealth difference, and income difference. How do you have those conversations? Because it's still possible to align everything.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think part of it is, as you said, it's entity type, right? And one of the things that, you have to really, and this is where you really do need a partner. Certainly we do a lot of entity selection, work and partner with folks to figure that out. But the more dollars involved, the more insistent I am about having a tax person at the table too. But in a very simplistic way, you sort of have C corps, right? You have S corps, and then you have this whole sort of family of different entities that are all taxes partnerships. And the C corp really, obviously, if you're doing that, you're doing it typically because you're trying to access a certain class of investor that probably wants to see the entity set up that way. And I think the S corp has been something that people are in love with, and there's some sort of payroll tax advantages to it. But the S corp is, to your point, is very restrictive. You cannot distribute money any differently than the ownership percentages. And so, I think sometimes people get, depending on, and I don't want to make this sound like it's the fault of the accountants. If you don't ask a bunch of questions about what is this thing today, what is your objective for it, where are you trying to take it? You can end up with something. What?
Planning?
Yeah. You can end up with something in an S corp wrapper that's a disaster. And, so, and one of the things I always say to people is you can make an S election down the line. You can't really, it's very difficult to undo it. Right. And so, we do a lot of partnership. When we talk about people an entity that has partners that are differently situated, like you're describing, I think a partnership, an entity that's taxed as a partnership is it would be my sort of starting point, because you really do have the ability there. You can allocate profits and losses differently. You can have multiple tranches. You can have preferred. You can have multiple tranches of returns. You can use, one of the things that people, aren't always familiar with, but you can use profits interest, which is sort of a really cool tool that you can use to bring people in after your business is up and running in a way that's tax advantageous to them.
Like, you're talking about PIUs and like phantom stock and stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I think, that to me, it's making sure you've got to understand the players and what their sort of situations and expectations are before you decide on an entity. And I think it's a mistake sometimes when people say, my buddy owns a car wash and he's an S corp, so I think I should be an S corp. Well, maybe your business is different from that in important ways.
Well, and it's also like, it's so funny because it's like, it's really what everybody desires is the inverse is actually the probably more the practical one, which what I mean is like, if let's say I'm half your age, I probably need more income. Mm-hmm. I do desire long-term wealth creation, but usually when someone's longer in their career, they need less income and they're optimizing for wealth. Right. So it's like, even though we both want what we just said, we're legally obligated to take the exact same amount. So if I need more to make my lifestyle work, you have to then, it's just like this weird.
I'll give you a really good example of the importance, if you want to like talk about a tangible example of the importance of an operating agreement in this exact setting that we're talking about. I saw recently a situation where you had 4 owners of a business and, one of whom had much different was in a much different place and had much greater wealth than the others. And they didn't have any provision that provided for tax distributions to cover the income that the partnership threw off. And so the only way they could do that is if they got majority agreement on that. And this person who had the wealth had the ability to block that. And so you have these other people who the problems that really feel frustrating.
You get a $50,000 tax bill while you're trying to pay your mortgage and pay for your kids' daycare and all that shit.
Yeah, with no cash to pay it, right? And the problems that really feel extremely frustrating, when a business fails, it's very difficult, very ugly, and sort of predictably so, right? The problems that feel really maddening are the ones where the business is doing well and you have a problem, because you're sort of like, how did we not create a situation where we could avoid this? And that was one where, those other three people that were killing it in the business were sort of being held hostage on some other things because they needed those tax distributions to make their lives work. And this other person who had the ability to block those was saying, well, it's not in the agreement. And so I'll do it, but only if you do X, Y, and Z. And, that's an example of, that's a huge miss to not have had the person sitting in my chair on the front end say, okay, let's raise this issue right now that you three have this situation, and we should have this provision in here. Or if we're not going to have it, it should be because I recommended it and you guys said, no, we don't need that. But I guarantee, I know for a fact that in that circumstance, nobody talked to those three about that. So they had no idea. They had never been in an ownership situation before. They had no idea that there was ever going to be a scenario where they could have tax and no cash to pay the tax, which people that have only worked obviously as employees, your taxes come out of your paycheck and, they're paid. You don't have to.
You have prepayment of taxes. What?
Right.
Quarterly estimates.
Right.
It's well, and I think also that it kind of goes back to, and we can move on after this, but like, it goes back to your earlier point of the resentment will come on some side, because it's either you have the cap on and you're going like, I don't like it. I can see both sides perfectly fair.
Totally.
And
Absolutely.
It just hasn't been discussed, to your point. So
That's
then
right.
It's like, we're sitting on the roller coaster going, should we be on this roller coaster?
Yeah.
Like, well, wouldn't it have been nice to know before we strapped in? And like, I think about if you've got the capital, you're like, now I'm put over a barrel because I'm going to be threatened by the people doing the work.
Totally.
And if you're the one doing the work, you're going, wait a second, all he has to do or she has to do is write a check and there's no effort. So there's
and the resentment thing is so huge. And I've had the conversation a whole bunch of times where, you've got somebody, a client of mine who's a sophisticated veteran of these kinds of arrangements, right? Coming into a situation where there's folks who are not that. And, you could see the perspective of, hey, I don't want to have a big discussion about this because these guys don't know what's going on and they'll just let us put it however we want and we can put it together in a way that's to my advantage. And my response to that is always, again, don't create a situation where the time where you have the biggest problems is when you have a successful business. If you have a conversation on the front end where everybody gets a chance to weigh in and you make decisions as a group, and you and I, have the full conversation when I'm bringing the capital and you're bringing the expertise about what you're going to get for that, and then we cut a deal that we both are okay with, then I have the benefit of if we kill it and you come back and say, I really want more money, at least I have the ability to say, geez, Ryan, we talked about this and we signed, we went through this whole process and we had a full conversation about it. And this is what we agreed to. So it feels like a retrade. I'm in a way better position than if I had tried to sort of, trick you into signing something on the front end and didn't have the ability to say we had a fair conversation about it.
Well, and like what you just said, the story you just said, I don't know if it's because my daughters are 6.5, but like how much shit in business right now. It's like, if I was talking to my kids, do you think that's fair?
Yeah.
Take all of the legal jargon bullshit out of it. Do you think that's fair or not? Yeah. No.
Couldn't agree more.
What else do we need to have a conversation about?
Totally agree.
And so, Dan, like, as we move on to like the governance, economics, exits, and crisis, we can kind of just keep using the examples to roll through these, but I want to make sure we don't forget them. But I'm thinking about like how rare it is, man, that like I sit down with someone and be like, I have a target equity valuation at a point in time. And by the way, here's my expectations from salary and distributions on the way there and how we're going to fund it. Like, it's a whopping zero pretty much.
Sure.
So then, like, how in the hell, when you're sitting down with someone, like, are you uncovering what my expectations for wealth creation or the income distributions might be? Like, is it more, do I want more dividends or more equity growth? And I think about like how many challenges that are, because like, here's where this is coming from, Dan, is I was at the Vistage workshop a couple weeks ago. I was in, it was the key executive group. I'm like, raise your hand if you're a key executive, CEO, president, or something like that. And you did your annual plan and it's like 20, you want to go from 20 million to 30 million. And everyone's like, whoa. And then all of a sudden the ownership group sucks all the distributions out. You got no funding for that plan. Like, yep, all the time. And it's because people just willy-nilly show up at these meetings like, hey, there's excess cash, let's take the money out. But there's no like synced up long-term plan. How do you uncover that when you're having these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's these conversations, as you know, are across a very wide spectrum of both, sophistication, expertise, experience. And so, I think you have to sort of try to figure out how to meet people where they are, but then, get them to, I think you have to build credibility.
A slightly better spot.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to build credibility by not trying to drop the 80-page template on them, by not saying, you need 80 pages and you need to pay me $20,000 to deal with every scenario that could ever unfold. Right. And instead just sort of say, okay, here's the thing. We need to create a situation where you have alignment. We need to be able, we're not going to be able to look out across the horizon of 40 years, right? What we need to be able to do is look out over this 5-year horizon and say, we need to create a situation that, one, deals with, kind of the key economics and governance issues that you're going to confront during that time in a way that you guys feel good about. And that hopefully creates a situation where there's, to go back to your point with your daughters, which I think is a really good point. I totally agree with you. It's not usually very complicated to figure out what's fair. To create a situation where if I'm doing something, for you and your business partner, when you're just achieving, just about to launch, I want to say, what I want to do is figure out all the stuff that we need to deal with in this first phase of the business and make sure that we've got that all covered. And then I want to create a situation where you guys are in a place that's fair in terms of when you do need to come back and change this thing in ways that reflect the way that your business has evolved in expected and unexpected ways. You're doing it from a place of fairness. You're not in a situation where you have no ability to control any of that. And that's one of the things, again, that I would say, certainly I've had 50-50 partner businesses that have worked and some that haven't. But even when you have 70-30 or 60-40 or whatever it is, I still always encourage that person that has a majority to give that minority person some decisions where they have to be unanimous. Because if somebody is in there getting jammed all the time and just getting constantly steamrolled, it's not going to work. And I mean, it's nice in theory. And the lawyer who drafts the one-sided document.
Let's take my daughters again. I've got one that'll just Zoe just beats Everly over the head a little bit. And it's like the bomb in Mario. It's coming, man.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's going to be lethal.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're in business together most of the time because you need each other, right? You bring complementary skills and talents. And so what kind of world is it to take a person that you need and try to put them at a disadvantage right off the bat? I mean, it just doesn't.
Well, and I'll be honest, man, like the conversations, I mean, for the listeners, I mean, Dan, you helped set up our last operating agreement, and the exercise of going through it is what helped. Yeah. Like, it's just like, because you're having that conversation ahead of time. Right. Yeah. Like, so that time going through and having these conversations, like, hey, we can go back to the drawing board and have this mature conversation. Cause I already remember having this conversation in the past and we were kind of like this. So let's roll into these 4 buckets. You're talking about governance, economics, exits, and crisis. So when you're talking about governance, what goes into governance, and then how does that overall management and decision-making work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, first of all, this is a good place to say, like, there's, people say, why do I need an operating agreement? I mean, first of all, if you have a business that's dealing with the outside world at all, whether that's banks or anybody they're going to want to see it. They want to see it to know that whoever's signing can in fact sign. So, I mean, you almost always need it for that reason. But, probably a full employment plan for lawyers, every state has a different LLC statute. The majority of those are built off of a model statute. So there's, significant overlap and similarity, but there's all these little traps and differences. And like, for example, there are default rules. I mean, there are states that have a default rule that says if you and I are partners, we have an equal vote, regardless of what our percentages are. It's sort of a per capita rather than a pro rata. So that's a good example of something that, that's usually not the way that's not aligned with people's expectations. So on governance, again, back to the point I just made, what I always say on governance is you got to think about it in tiers. If you and I are going into business together, even if we're going to be 70-30, my own view is that there are certainly exceptions to this, but my own view is that, there are going to be things that that we should have unanimity around. There are going to be decisions that we're going to make. I think a good example would be, if you and I agree, for example, usually if we agree that we've got a separate expectation around employment, you're going to be the person working in the business, right? And so we come up with an employment agreement for you that gives you a salary and gives you a bonus structure. I think it doesn't make a lick of sense for me to be able to just change that because I have 70%. I mean, that would be a good example of something that I just think is totally counterproductive. If we're going to change the mission of the business, if we're making widgets and now we're going to, go sell ice cream, I mean, we've got to have a conversation about that and it doesn't do me any good to be able to sort of jam you into that anyway, because you're not going to go along with that. So I think you have to drive a conversation about what are the things about this that you both are sort of have perfect alignment on, that are sort of the reasons you're doing this, that you should have some, that you should have. A lot of the stuff we
talked about, right? I mean, and that's why we don't have to cover governance too much. Because if I believe in ours, it was pay, job responsibilities, but then also our desired distributions, how we're handling taxes. I think that's all. It has to be universal.
Exactly. And a good example is what we talked about earlier, the tax distributions, right? If you and I are in that position and I'm the one bringing the capital and you've got more of an income need from the business, I shouldn't be able to just take away the tax distributions without you signing off on that. So you usually, if you have a good conversation with people, you usually come up with a half a dozen things that, that should be in that category. And then you've got other things that are just in the category of, the majority does control, and you've got other things that are in the category of, the majority controls, but then you get a buyout. I can, for example, in that scenario where you're the employee, most majority owners are not going to agree to give up the ability to terminate the employment. But then most people who are in the employee role are going to say, yeah, that's fine. But then I get bought out. If you're going to terminate my employment, then I get to be bought out because I don't want to be a passive owner in this business where the only reason I got in is because I know how to run it.
I love that example. Let's pull that thread for a second. And the reason I love it, Dan, is because I have been just beating the drum of the separation of leadership versus ownership roles. However, just because they're separate, the concept needs to be understood. But what I think was crucial that you just hit on is you can still, as long as you understand they're separate, tie them to an event, right? Like you just said. So like a lot of professional services firms, I've seen this with a lot of our clients where it's like, hey, you get to a point where you don't want a lot of passive owners of professional services firms, aka law firms and CPA firms, right? Totally. Where they get up top and it's all the people that are doing the labor can't get access to the ownership. But so explain that again, maybe restate it, like how you can have them separate, but then you can tie them towards an outcome that you desire.
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's sort of, and I've always said, I've had owners who have been in the process of bringing in a key executive level manager person who've said, and have asked me, what do these arrangements typically look like? And you sort of start to talk about that and they say, well, don't raise this or that with them because I don't want to give them that unless they ask for it. And it's like, the this or that is about alignment. It's about creating alignment. And I mean, I'm going to make more money if you and I are aligned. And if you think that the way for you to make more money is to have me make more money. Right. And so,
it's like a novel concept, right?
The examples that we see a lot are, you'll create, obviously, like I said, if you're going to have employee owners, I think that there should absolutely be a buyout. I would tell majority owners of businesses, I wouldn't give up the right to terminate someone, but I would say if you're terminating them for cause, or if they just leave to go somewhere else, then that's probably buyout scenario A, where they probably don't do as well. But if you're terminating them without cause because you just found somebody you think's better, or if they leave because you took away a bunch of their responsibilities, they should get, they should get an attractive buyout. And quite frankly, someone who agrees to sign on to a scenario where that's not in place probably isn't someone who's going to be somebody that you want. I mean, if somebody doesn't
focus on it, right?
No, if you're hiring a C-level person and you don't have a negotiation, I think it's a huge red flag. I mean, they've got to be able to advocate for themselves, or they shouldn't be in that role. Is my own view. And so there's a lot of places like that. You talk about compensatory things. I mean, if you're my guy running the business and I'm the capital, and I've put a bonus program out there for you, I mean, I don't think I should, just because I have a majority ownership, I don't think I should be able to change that. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Because it's operational, right? Whether it was me or a different president, you would operationally still put that together for your asset that you want to grow in value.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you hit it on the head. I mean, that stuff, probably most of it, there certainly becomes, when you have employee owners, there's an overlap between the operating agreement and some of the other agreements, but there's usually a suite of other agreements too. You're usually, most of my clients who have that set up, where they have a business either that's big enough that they just need a bunch more management horsepower than they themselves can provide, or where they're passive, they're using multiple tools to create that alignment. And then they have the wisdom to go back and revisit it. I've had transactions, those kinds of transactions that we all love to work on, where somebody started something and it turned into a business that was worth a whole bunch of money. And, you have key lieutenants who, it's funny, people think they've won if they get to, a transaction and they haven't made any commitments to their key lieutenants. They think, oh, this is great. I got this all the way to this exit and I don't owe anybody any money. Well, the buyer comes in and looks and says, oh, Dan's been off in Scottsdale for the last 10 years while these 3 key lieutenants have been running the business, and they have no agreements in place of any kind. And so the only way I'm going to buy Dan's business is if he takes 25% of the purchase price and gives it to these people and gets them to sign on to something that's going to restrict them from going and doing this on their own. And I've been saying to clients for years, and just had a couple exits recently where, we had key people that were under agreements, and, you don't have to have that conversation. You know what you're doing. You've created that alignment. Everybody's winning. I mean, it's way
think about
better.
The due diligence and all the anxiety, even in the 6 months prior to even getting to the point where that messed up situation probably got there too. So let's talk about exits. I want to do a time check here because I want to talk about exits and buyouts and valuations, and then the crisis kind of looped into one. Are we good with that?
Yeah. Cool. Oh yeah.
So let's talk about the buyouts then, because buyouts, there's a huge umbrella of this, right? And I don't know if you want to lump in exits and crisis, but there's out of the blue offers, actually prepping to go to sale. There's all these different combinations, but maybe we'd start with your overall approach and philosophy towards handling that topic in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, there's sort of a spectrum, right? If you're talking about a brand new business, I always tell people I don't want to, try to build an aircraft carrier to go sail around on Lake Calhoun. You got to know where you are in the life cycle. If people are coming in here wanting to put in $25,000 to start a consulting business, I think that's a different scenario from a buyout perspective than if somebody's coming in dropping 10 million to get, a manufacturing operation off the ground. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, I would say you got to know what you're dealing with. But I think anything that has any level of investment in it has to have, as you said, different scenarios, right? Certainly in many ways, the exit scenario where someone buys your company is the easiest. I mean,
let's go before we go down the exit or the kind of the death, disability crisis, all the fun stuff, right? Let's talk about just personal circumstance. I've gone through plenty of clients where there will be when the buyout's happening, it will be either a cash flow valuation or it'll be some sort of negotiated evaluation because there's not enough cash flow there, because in a lot of even significant companies could have that same example if they're on a growth mode. So call it growth no cap or no cash flow versus the cash flow valuation. How do you handle that?
Yeah. And I think you got to understand your customer, right? I mean, because I deal with people who have a very clear understanding of those dynamics that you just described, right? They understand that the business isn't going to throw off cash. And I deal with people that don't. And so, you can have a business, as but not everybody does. You can have a business that that you could go get a valuation and someone could say it's worth $5 million that doesn't generate any cash, right? At that point in its life cycle.
Right.
And so that's, one of the things I always say is I don't like mandatory buyouts absent some kind of funding mechanism. So I always say to people, if you're going to have a mandatory buyout, then death is a good example. Then you need a life insurance or something so that you're not in a position where somebody just decides, I don't want to be here anymore, so I'm leaving, and you have to pay me. Well, pay you with what? First of all,
how many people listening in have had that conversation in their head or with a family member or a partner?
So first, to your point, how do we value it, and then pay you with what? So I think, you can have scenarios. A lot of times, even from the get-go, we'll have two different scenarios, right? We'll have someone comes in and buys the company. It's easy. Everybody gets their share of the proceeds, and it's a big party. The other scenario,
as you're going, Dan, think about too, because at that scenario, I think people get caught between this, and they don't think that there's, as you go on the scenario too, because hey, we have to sell this because Dan wants his money. So sorry, I had to, because that's what. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things when you talk about overriding the normal rule that the majority owner or owners get to decide everything. I mean, one of the things I'm a big fan of is this sort of drag along, tag along concept that just says, if I'm a 70% owner and you're 30, if I want to sell, I get to make you sell as long as you get the same economics as me. You don't get to block that. And the flip side of that is if I'm going to go sell, you get to sell as well. You don't have me having the ability to foist a new partner on you. So, I'm a big fan of those. And that's a scenario where I think it's very unusual for a minority to be able to force a sale, but I think the drag along, tag along, giving a minority a legal right to participate as long as they get the same economics. So I do that I use that as a starting point, almost every time. But I just think if you have any complexity in the business, you're almost always going to have different buyout scenarios, and you're going to have more than one buyout scenario. So you're going to have the buyout scenario where someone comes in and buys the business, easy, everybody gets their share of it. You're going to have the buyout scenario maybe where somebody dies and you have insurance, so they're going to get bought out with cash. And you might say in that circumstance, you might have different valuations. I mean, in the purchase exit.
Yeah, why don't you explain that too? Because I think that's helpful of the when and how the different valuations based on the purpose impacts, and then also expand on the life insurance. I think a lot, because I think a lot of people have those set up way wrong where the tax implications are super effed up.
Yeah. So you have to, insurance is a place too, where if you're dealing with anything of any significance in terms of dollar values, I just think you've got to have a good professional on the team, and a bunch, and so do I. And I always get them involved if we're dealing with anything of consequence. But, valuation is really tricky, right? Because first of all, you don't want to, my thought, it sort of goes back to, I love the example you brought up with your daughters, because I think this whole thing goes back to that. You want to have all of these conversations happening against a backdrop of trying to create, fairness for the parties here. And I think, 99% of the people I've ever worked with, that's what they want too. And so you can help them get there. I think the external sale is easy because somebody comes in and says, this is what it's worth, and you either accept that or you don't. But in a death scenario or in somebody leaves employment scenario, I think, to your point, I've seen both oversimplifying. People tend to either use some kind of formula that they set up on the front end, or they tend to use an appraisal, and just say, we'll go get an appraisal. Significant.
Which I want your thoughts on appraisals, man.
Yeah, so
this last 12 months, I've seen probably a dozen plus of appraisals for people going through an internal buyout because of a death or something. And I'm like, that appraiser knows nothing about that business, man.
It's a really good point. And I would say to you, my viewpoint on that has changed over time because of what you just described. I think that the delta between what a business is going to appraise for is, in my estimation, larger than it's ever been. I mean, and I've seen businesses in recent times where the appraisal has just been, to your point, just this is crazy. Nobody would ever buy this for this. Even in this environment that has been pretty frothy, I still see appraisals
sorry, we're kind of digressing or going down this rabbit hole, but I think it's relevant, is because I was on this internal buyout and this advisor was like explaining their ideas on working capital, multiples, all this stuff. I'm like, fine, I'm hearing you loud and clear. And I was truly like, I was giving that individual the benefit of the doubt, but I'm like, if you ran the numbers, this thing won't pay for itself for like 20 years. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, that's not part of my job. And I'm like, what is it then? And he's like, and he goes, well, I deal with divorces and estate planning. And I'm like, you're pushing legal documents around to jam a solution down someone's throat for your client, not necessarily responsible for covering payroll and taxes and working capital. Yeah. So I don't know, how would you describe that to the audience in maybe a more graceful way than I did?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I would say, I mean, honestly, just kind of taking a step back from a very high level, what I would say is I think you should be very cautious about moving away in an exit scenario where someone buys the business. I think you should be very cautious about moving away from anything that's not just we divvy it up and that's it. And conversely, I think you should be very cautious about all the other exit scenarios. You should be very cautious about taking steps to make sure you don't have a valuation that comes in way too high, and that you understand cash flow dynamics of the buyout. Because you can't wreck the business. And that's the scenario, back to what I said, is if you and I are partners, and you just decide not because, I'm the majority, not because I terminate you, or, you just decide you don't want to deal with me anymore because I'm annoying, and you leave.
Finally, you're to the truth here, Dan.
Right. Then I don't like having a scenario where I have to buy you out. I like having a scenario where I have the option. I can either buy you out, or I can say, that's fine, Ryan, now you can be the passive owner, and I'll buy you out, whenever we come to an agreement, or whenever whenever it makes sense for the business. So, I will say the formula, it depends on whose hands it's in, with somebody with the experience and expertise that you have. Obviously, I think a formula, you can come to an agreement on a formula. I think one of the things I've observed is you take, I've had buy-sells that I've inherited. I've inherited because someone's come to me when they're in a fight with their partner and said, what do I do here? And you had a formula that somebody put in there on the front end that they used in some other buy-sell somewhere that doesn't make any sense for this business. Mm-hmm. That creates a situation, and I've seen them in both directions, right? A business that you think is worth $5 million, that the formula says is worth $500,000, or that says is worth $50 million. Yep. Because there's something that changed about the way the formula works that they haven't accounted for. So one thing I will say is I usually do, when you use a formula, I usually put some kind of parameters around it, use a formula, but then put a collar on it, or use a formula.
Describe the collar, because I think I'm tracking it. But
just sort of saying, like, if you're going to have an EBITDA formula, you might have, a net income collar. You sort of trying to have two different markers to make
you have
sure
to be hitting these kind of things to make sure that the thing works out, and that the timeline and the amortization schedule, all that stuff.
Or if you had an EBITDA formula, you might be in a place where, the EBITDA formula would work as long as the business is the size it is. But you've seen this before, obviously. A business that does the same thing could be worth a multiple, could go from being worth a multiple of 5 to being worth a multiple of 10 if they grow the business.
Well, and actually, there's a real life example. I was working with these two guys, and the younger guy actually wanted to buy the older guy out, and the company was growing so freaking fast, Dan, that he's like there was no way he could buy out his other partner unless he had equity. There was because they're not making any. Right. They're pushing everything just to hit their taxes.
Yeah. So I think sometimes what can happen is that people I think if you're going to use the appraisal concept, you got to be very careful and put some parameters around it. And quite frankly, people hate this, but sometimes it's creating a situation where you got to go get an appraisal, and so do I. And then we got to have a battle about it, because doing that just sort of acknowledges the reality, which is that the appraisals can be very different depending on who's doing it and for what purpose. But I would say the same thing. I just would say the same thing to people about formulas. You got to be very careful with the formula, that it's something that you think is durable, and that you sort of stress test a little bit with some examples about the business evolving in different directions than what you think. And at the end of the day, you probably have to recognize that, again, this probably goes in the category of, if you're trying to build an operating agreement that's going to work perfectly for 50 years, that's probably not going to happen. You probably have to accept the fact that you're going to probably try to figure out how to do something that works for your first phase, and you're going to have to revisit it.
So then, and then we're getting short on time here, but I want to, I think we covered governance, economics for the most part, and then exits. Before we move on from exits to crisis, and I just really kind of speak into like death and like disability, kind of just like how do you handle that, like, which my guess is not a ton of complications behind it. But with the exits, Dan, let's talk about like, the situations that I run into weekly, which you probably do too, is we got an out of the blue offer because all of this shit that you and I just discussed was not done. Dan goes, "Oh, my ticket's here. Finally, Ryan, I want to now sell." And so like, there's like the out of the blue offer. Okay, great, Dan, that's fine. And kind of the drag along, tag on, that might be part of your answer, but like, how do you assess that? And then like, let's say okay, Dan, that's fine. Maybe we take it to market, but how does that decision tree go?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky, right? I mean,
the listeners listening in right now that I'm probably going to send 1,000 times when I get these calls, that's your response. It's really tricky.
No, I mean, it's a total dodge, but it's so true. I mean, it's something that I just have such a strong feeling about dealing with on the front end. And again, it's in the hierarchy of problems to avoid. Man, what a nightmare when you have a problem where the business is doing well and you have an event that's pretty predictable, not a crazy event. Somebody wants to buy it and you haven't dealt with it, because, and to your point, I mean, it's really tricky because you get the person who's in your chair, to use the example we've been using where I'm 70 and you're 30 and I'm the capital and you're the brains behind the operation, which sort of rings true to me. This person is coming in wanting to buy this thing, and I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome. And you're sitting there with all the cards and saying that they're not doing it unless they get me, and they're not getting me unless I get X. And when I go talk to my lawyer about how am I going to make Ryan sell his interest, and they're going to be like, what are you talking about? You're not going to make him do anything. And so that's where I always say to the people that think they're holding all the cards at the beginning, if you think that it's in your interest holding the cards to not have this stuff nailed down, you're crazy, because you want to create a situation where Ryan is signed up for, this is how it's going to work. If that person shows up with that big bag of money, this is how we're going to divvy it up. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't done it, the 70
and the opposite is
awful.
Totally true too. Cause like I could see like, yo, dude, I want to make $500,000 to go start something else. And you're going, hey, Ryan, I'm kind of digging my $100,000 distribution. Like, why don't you get back to work, buddy?
Yeah, totally.
And it's, and by the way, to be fair, Dan, the punt is total and the dodge is totally acceptable. Cause you want to know why, dude? Like this morning, I did that to this call because the listeners I get the calls every week. Ryan, I want out. Ryan, I got another blue offer. My partner and I are not aligned. What should I do? I want to get this wrapped up in 60 days. And I'm just like, the analogy I used this morning, I was like, hey, like you got the trigger event, which isn't that nice to know that it's worth something? However, what I'm hearing is like, I had a stroke.
Yeah.
What should I do? And then I said, well, you should have been eating well, sleeping well, and exercising 10 years ago. And I'm sorry, I'm not the ER doctor.
It's so funny that you say that, because that's exactly the analogy I was going to go to is, it's interesting because people, understandably, I get it. We don't do anything tangible. We put words on paper and move them around. But they can't, when they come to you, when the patient comes to the doctor and says, I had a stroke and what do I do? And the doctor says, well, I've been telling you for 10 years that something like this was going to happen if you didn't change X, Y, and Z, and you haven't changed X, Y, and Z. So get in the time machine and go back and listen to me is what you should do. And people sort of understand that, I think more so than they do in my business where they come in and they say, I'm in this situation. I want you to fix this. And it's like, it's kind of the same deal. It's kind of like, you had the stroke. I can't, we need to go back in the time machine. We need to get back there. And I would say the other thing. I had a dude call me like 3 months ago. He's like, hey,
Ryan, I been listening to your podcast for like 2 years, sold my company, got the purchase agreement all done and everything like that. And I'm going to make about $45 million. What can I do for taxes? And I was like, you haven't been listening to me for 4 years then. Because there's nothing you can
had it on in the background. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
apparently.
Right. I mean, it's so true. And I do think, and the other analogy that I would throw out there is it's sort of like, someone comes to you and has a spouse that is just a jerk all the time and tells you 10 stories about how their spouse is a jerk and sort of what should I do? And it's sort of like, you probably need that same time machine. That's probably not a great spouse. And I think that's one of the things I would just always say to people too, is like, if you find yourself in either direction, right? This stuff needs to be, worked out on the front end to create alignment and aligned expectations. But at the same time, if you think that if you don't have a good vibe about your partner and you feel like we need to get everything right down to who has to pay for the coffee and how many cups, then there's a point at which you should say, this might not be a great idea. You might need to find a different, way to interact with this person than to become partners. Because the one thing in all of this is no matter how good the document is, you have to be able to work together and you have to be able to work through things together.
It's so true, man. I think the arrangement that my daughters have, it's so funny because like the spirit of the law, I think it's really interesting. There's a couple of books I've read recently on democracies, and it's amazing how much our country is built on the spirit.
Oh yeah,
totally. And actually are not written down. No. But then what you're talking, and what I think is so crucial is like you're talking through these things to think through them. Yeah. Right. Like that's the whole point. Before we wrap up, Dan, I just got to because it's so common with buy sell agreements, and you can debunk my thought process because I've kind of got myself in a rut, but like so many insurance reps jam buy sell agreements down people's throats and they're not set up correctly. The money goes outside the company. It's taxed again. You just kind of give an overall like philosophy of how to approach death and disability with these buyouts with partners.
Yeah. I would say, a couple things. One, I don't really believe in, I believe in, I obviously have a whole bunch of clients that have insurance programs. If you're big enough to need an insurance program, if you've created enough value to need an insurance program, then you have created enough value to get the right people to set it up. Some of the stuff that goes on in this space is just outrageous, both in terms of the structure and in terms of the price people pay. The reality is if you and I are partners and we have a business that's worth $1 million, right? And we're 50-50. So you've got $500 worth of $500,000 worth of value. That's not a taxable estate. That's not anything that's going to be nightmarish from a income tax perspective. if something happens to you and I've got to pay out your wife over 5 years, you and I should figure out how to do that. We don't, the time when, if our business is worth $100 million and you have an estate tax problem and we have some liquidity issues where that's your whole estate, we've got to figure out an insurance program and we've got to get somebody in there that can get that set up in a tax advantageous way.
Some of that fully loaded insurance shit actually probably mathematically makes sense at that point.
That's right. And I think I think honestly, my advice on that front is to echo what you said, which is my advice to people is to be extremely skeptical about it. I'd say, 5 to 10% of my clients have really fully built out programs because they have a liquidity issue that requires it. But most of the time, you can figure out a way to just, as long as you're paying attention to the concepts of valuation and cash flow that you and I talked about earlier, we can figure out a way to get, your wife the money that she has coming to her out of the business in a way that doesn't wreck the business and doesn't jam, you. Well, I think
I'd have to look at ours, but I believe ours has in it that it triggers the actual buyout because our partners don't want to be partners with each other as spouses. It's like, hey, let's just deal with it at the right economic value that based on the valuation discussion that we've already had. So it's like, hey, and then what I see recently, it was something where the insurance went to the individual, not to the company. They paid double taxes, dude. It was just like the whole point of the insurance. I know, it was just ridiculous.
The tax nightmares that happen here because somebody's chasing the commission, and it's just like a race to try to get signatures on the page to get the commission locked in. It's so just true. Crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. Oh man, this has been a conversation that is. I would have laughed 10 years ago if I would have said I was really excited to have a conversation about operating agreements. But like, dude, the two sides of the coin are it's the financial roadmap, and then there's the spirit of the arrangement, which is the law. Yeah. And it's like, this is it, man. And like all of the problems I see every day of like so many people I could help, it's because I didn't do these two things right.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, it's sort of like that thing that everybody, talks about when it comes to taking care of yourself physically. Like, it's not, it's okay that you didn't do it for the last, 5 years. Start doing it today. And that's what I would always say, to your point earlier. Like, you can get this stuff figured out midstream. It's not the end of the world. I think sometimes people think, oh, we didn't do it, and we're kind of embarrassed that we didn't do it. I mean, you can get it figured out midstream, and kind of no matter where you are, getting something done and getting some of these things squared away is better than nothing. But to your point, the scenario where the person shows up and says, I had a stroke, what do I do? It's like, I don't know. I call an ambulance.
Which is not me, by the way.
No.
Right. And the ambulance chasers should probably charge $900 an hour, and they're going to, because they see the carcass and there's only so much blood.
Yeah.
And I just think, Dan, it's like the thought of like having, maybe as we're wrapping up, your thoughts on how someone should assess the attorney or the people next to them. And I'm going to give you the out here, because what you're probably going to say is going to sound self-promoting, and it's not. I just trying to think it through is like how important it is that someone has been through that, because they're trying to paint the picture of the future. How do you, if you've never experienced the future, how do you hire someone? Because before it was like, hey, I could have a beer with Dan. Yeah. So like, I should hire Dan. Sure. Like, outside of that, what are some of your thoughts?
I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say I've certainly sat on this side of the table, but from having sat on this side of the table, I feel like I have an understanding of the conversation and what it should look like. And what I would say is, if I'm going to set up an operating agreement for you, the bulk of our first meeting should be you talking. I should be asking you questions about what you want to have happen, what your vision is, what are you worried about? What are the ways? What does it look like for this business to succeed? What does it look like for it to fail? And, I think you can only do a good job with the documents if you get a download from the client group about what they collectively are concerned about. I don't think there should be an operating agreement, that everybody in the mix hasn't had a chance to talk to the lawyers on. I get really uncomfortable if I've got one person saying, I want you to put this together, and they're telling me what they think, but I've got 3 other people that I've never met that are out there somewhere who are going to be asked to sign this thing. So, I mean, I think a lot of it, as you and I have talked about before, there's a lot of really good lawyers. I think more good lawyers than bad lawyers. I think if somebody's just trying to pull a document off the shelf, and I'm not saying like we have different templates that we use as starting points for different situations. But if somebody just asks 5 questions, what's the name of the business? What's the address? Who are the owners? What are the percentages? Who are the managers? And that's it. And they give you a document. I mean, I think there's a pretty good chance that document's not a good fit. So, I mean, to me, that's what I would say is like, if I was going to say, how would you easily judge a conversation? I would say judge it by how much did you talk and how much did I talk? And if I talk the whole time, it's probably not very good.
Yeah. I like that, Dan. And what I'll add to that is, if someone asks, so let's say I'm the owner in that situation, and the attorney asks me, what would you like me to put in this?
Yeah.
Like, what the like? It's like, it's so funny, because I've over the last couple of years, it's amazing how many people have to be explained what a CFO's actual capabilities are and some of the stuff that we're doing, and it's like, if a CFO asks you what's around the corner, you're in a shit's creek. Because like the whole point of an architect is to walk you through the blueprint. And I think about your role, it's like, here's all of the ways this could go. Yeah. And then you're helping people think through it instead of going, well, what do you need?
Which I can't do unless I've listened to you tell me about your business and your vision and the partnership group and who's doing what and all that stuff. Yep. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It circles back to what we said before. If you try to go hire somebody to be a CEO and they don't want to negotiate some compensatory elements that create alignment, they probably aren't the person for that job either, you know?
Well, it just like I look at like it's true that iron against iron will make that value growth and all this stuff actually succeed. Like you said, dude, this has been so fun. Like I said, who would have thought, right?
Yeah.
So
it's always fun. Thanks for having me.
Two final questions, and I'm going to ask the first one again because I don't know if you were on the podcast when it was called Intentional Growth.
Yeah.
But I asked people what the word means to them because I love hearing their definition. So I want to know what your definition of intentional is.
Intentional. Yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of, I think you're not, I think I had some English teachers sometimes tell me you're not supposed to define things by their opposites, but I sort of do that with that word. I love that word and I use it with my kids a lot. And I think to me, it means, you know, taking the time to think about what you want to do and why, as opposed to just sort of drifting. And I think of it as being sort of the opposite of drift.
Ooh, I love that, dude. I like that a lot. Best place to get in touch with you if people want to reach out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, you know me. Your comments about the conference bridge sort of landed close to home. I mean, I'm the oldest 46.
Dude, you're in your 40s, so the people listening can't see you. You gotta. But I'm, you know, we've got, you know, we're a law firm with the old school website, and I'm there, and I'm on LinkedIn. I don't really do much beyond that on social media. So, and I, you know, but all my stuff is on my. You can Google me. I mean, you know, what more sophisticated method could there be than Google? I think my team, like years back, tried to tag you guys on social. It's like, hey guys, let's not go.
It's better now. Allie's on it. So, but I'm not.
That's awesome. Hey Dan, I appreciate you coming in, man. This has been awesome.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.